You've probably heard the phrase thalassophobia before. In the past few years, it has garnered a lot of popularity on the internet, and with good cause. You see, an extreme or unreasonable dread is typically referred to as a phobia. But I can promise you that fearing the water is neither absurd nor improper. It is a hostile, enormous, infinitely deep, and gloomy place. It is actually an abyss. It creates a hostile environment due to the pressure, lack of light, and numerous other factors. And yet, thousands of people go scuba diving every year. Thousands of people go on cruises, and that's not even counting the individuals whose whole occupation it is to travel in submarines deep down for military defense or study. Anyhow, the two occurrences I'm going to discuss are ones I've kept to myself for far too long, but you'll quickly realize that I can't exactly discuss them with friends, family, or even a therapist for that matter, lest I want to be classified as insane. If memory serves, it must have been in the 4th or 5th grade when I was in primary school. Please be patient with me if I seem a little hazy on some of the specifics, because it has been well over 30 years. The exam that would have allowed me to go swimming and take lessons in the deep end of the pool, which was around 11 feet at its greatest depth, had finally been passed. I had been enrolled in an after-school swim program for what I recall to be many weeks prior to that time. The major reason I wanted to go there was because my friends, who I thought were the greatest people in the world at the time, were already enrolled in challenging lessons. You can only imagine how happy I was to see my name on the board for the deep end lesson schedule and outline when I arrived at my first class. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded as usual. The teachers went through the schedule for the day, as well as the game we would play at the conclusion if we behaved ourselves during the real classes. For a bunch of rambunctious elementary school students, it's easier said than done, but kids will be kids. My first task of the day was to perfect my diving technique. One by one, we would ascend the starting blocks and dive in. The instructors would then provide us with critique and suggestions for how to improve. I couldn't help but look behind the teacher as she listed off the directions, as she stood just at the edge of the pool. I was so excited but also a little frightened. The color of the water was a rich cobalt blue. It appeared foggy but paradoxically clear. Its spooky depths were only made more visible by the lights at the bottom. But I ignored my apprehension at the time. It was just a pool, so what could possibly go wrong? When the time finally came for me to do my dive, my buddies encouraged me as I prepared in the best possible manner. I then peered down below and observed how the blue abyss had been eagerly waiting for my arrival. In that instant, something just seemed off. I wasn't sure what it was, but I could feel that something wasn't quite right. However, I was being watched, and the last thing I wanted to do was make the rest of the class wait. As I dove in, the splash's crashing sound distorted as I descended below the water surface. My eyes were closed as I let myself to sunk several feet below the surface, savoring the bliss of the depth, the water feeling cool and pleasant against my skin. But I was aware that I couldn't stay beneath for too long if I didn't want my instructor to correct me. I opened my eyes with the intention of looking up and returning to the water surface, but as I nearly broke my neck to do so, I couldn't help but let out a loud, terrified gasp. The surface above me didn't appear to be just a few feet above me, but rather dozens. My mind wasn't even trying to figure out how that was possible. I was too busy starting to fear. Well over 40 or so feet. I went ahead and looked below and around me as well, which only ratcheted up the panic to 11. No pool walls, patterns, or tiles could be seen when I whipped my head left and right. Instead, I was met with a cobalt blue emptiness that seemed to go on forever. There is only water in every way. My ears would have popped, and I would have felt something on my young, frail body if I were really as deep as I thought. But I drifted there instead. I took the opportunity to gaze down, an error that caused me so much worry and horror that I'm very convinced it shorted my life by a few years. I was unable to determine how deep the sea was below me, whether it was hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of feet. The only thing I could actually make out was the blue steadily falling till it was completely black. A well-tested chasm. I was there, suspended in the center of it. The time that had elapsed was only a few seconds, but in the quiet depths, those seconds felt more like minutes. I quickly focused on the surface and started to frantically kick my way up to it. I yelled out fruitless cries for aid, pleading with whatever God would hear me to help me leave the waking nightmare I had just found myself in, as bubbles appeared and nearly obscured my eyesight. I was clinging on for dear life during every kick and every stroke. What is the worst part of it? My own pleas for my mother could hardly be heard, although my impending drowning seemed to approach faster than the surface itself. It actually didn't. As I watched my hand futilely reach out and clutch at the surface, as if pleading for its pity, my lungs started to burn, and I could feel myself starting to slide away. I believed it would be the last of me, that I would pass out there and then, and that my corpse would be left to float in the blue and black abyss. My eyes started to close once more, but this time much less voluntarily. By the second, I could feel my lungs constricting painfully. Just when I believed I would make my final call for aid before everything went black, I was abruptly overcome with the powerful and familiar sensation of breaking the water's surface. In addition, I felt strong hands around my shoulders pulling me upward with a firm conviction. Whoever it was had their fingers pressing firmly into my flesh. When I opened my eyes again, I looked up and saw something that simultaneously brought me relief and caused me great confusion. It was the ceiling of the indoor pool I had been in just a short while earlier. I started to cough and spit out water when a severe feminine voice erupted, blasting its way into my obstructed ears. "You shouldn't stay underwater for that long after a dive. You should be sitting out for the rest of the day." That was reckless and could have gone far worse. My swimming instructor's voice was heard, and I was listening to her out of habit while I put my palms against the pool area floor. The solid tile provided a euphoric sense of comfort that I hadn't thought was possible. "Jackson, did you hear me?" she reprimanded. "You're done for the rest of the day." But I was too terrified and bewildered to give the punishment I had just received much thought. I did realize, though, that I had just gone through a completely odd and inexplicable event. A very real cry from the vacuum. Later that day, when I tried to explain it to my parents at home, they laughed it off as the figment of a young child's overactive mind. Probably should have anticipated that. But I did learn from it, which is why I haven't told anyone else since. Not up until this point. I don't necessarily have to blame my parents, or anyone else for that matter, for their skepticism. After all, even though I had experienced it, I still couldn't believe it. The roughest days came right after the incident, and much to my parents' and friends' chagrin, I dropped out of swimming class right away. I also made a special effort to stay away from any sizable bodies of water, not that I lived close to many. In contrast, if I came into contact with lakes, rivers, or pools, I had to stay away from them. I also limited my bathing to only showers, not a bath. I made every effort to bury the recollection as far into the back of my mind as I could, but it remained that way for a long time. However, I am now telling you everything about it. Obviously did not work. Aside from my newfound aversion to any body of water deeper than a few inches, my life had ended up being very typical. After completing elementary school, I entered middle school. For the first few years of my adolescence, I had a conventional experience. I met friends, went on excursions, got into trouble. Things were going really well, and I was almost ready to forget about the event entirely. Up until the second incident, that is. You see, my grandmother passed away not long after I finished 8th grade. I was quite shocked because I just had good recollections of her, and she loved having me as a grandchild. She was a respected, loving, and compassionate woman. A part of me was relieved that she would soon be reunited with my grandfather, because I could tell that his death a few years earlier had had a significant impact on her. In my early years, they both served as more than just admirable role models. She had always been excellent at keeping a cheerful and cheery attitude, but occasionally she would allow herself to falter, which was more than understandable. According to what my mother had told me, he had always been a loving husband and father to her. My group of friends from the time asked me to their home for a pool party about a week after she passed away. Surprisingly, I accepted without any hesitation because I figured the social connection would be beneficial. It's better to have some fun and distract myself while I'm grieving. Although the initial incident had mainly been forgotten, I continued to experience anxiety whenever I watched or saw images of deep water. I simply gave up looking for any logical answers for what took place. You see, my pal loved swimming a lot. Furthermore, his parents were quite wealthy, which always left me wondering why he hadn't attended a private school. They could erect a diving board because the deepest end of the pool they owned was little over 9 feet. Additionally, it was kept up properly and looked nicer than most public pools, with a sapphire blue hue that made looking at the water nearly ecstatic. Once I got the pool in my direct line of sight and arrived at the party, I noticed a tiny tingling in my stomach, but it rapidly vanished as I started chatting and shooting the breeze with my pals. Naturally, I didn't actually into the pool for a time. Instead, I stayed on the sidewalk a few feet away, holding my cup of punch. At the time, my peers were chatting, but I didn't really think about joining until Jennifer, my longtime crush at the time, started making fun of me for my hesitation. Peer pressure was what ultimately did me in after all that time had passed. She jokingly challenged, "Come on, Jackson, you're gonna turn to dust if you just keep standing around up there." Looking up at me with a look of curiosity and a hint of mischief. I grinned. I made an effort to be cool, but it was short-lived once some of my other pals started chanting in jest, joining Jennifer's light-hearted mockery. They echoed, "Jumpin' Jackson, Jumpin' Jackson, Jumpin' Jackson." So I made my way over to one of the tables, put my cup down, turned, and without giving myself any more time to think, I leaped into the room with a dashing jump. It had been a very long time since I had experienced the sensation of being immersed. The cool water, though, had been more than soothing. It was a welcome change of scenery from the hot, muggy weather I had been experiencing all day. Naturally, I had closed my eyes before cannonballing into the pool, jumping off the edge of the sidewalk. Just like the previous time, I had kept them closed for a brief period of time after breaking through the water's surface. I thought I would just climb my way back to the surface as soon as I could after sensing myself sunk a few feet. After all, in the years following the initial incident, I hadn't lost my swimming ability. But as soon as I opened my eyes, my stomach dropped, which started to churn itself. When I looked down, all I could see was water. There is by no means any tile, concrete, or other type of floor. I was simply hovering above a pitch-black chasm. I immediately screamed like a scared little girl, which I suppose I was in theory, but while I drifted there, I became aware that I had brought back a nightmare I had believed to have left in the past. I quickly turned to look up and noticed that, similar to the previous time, I appeared to be around 40 feet below the surface. Even when my mental condition is heightened, I didn't spend any time in starting to swim toward it. I was hoping for much better results than before, but not even a few seconds had elapsed when something abruptly interrupted my desperate attempt to flee, a scene that both my eyes and my brain found perplexing. I noticed what appeared to be a towering, broad pattern of gray squares on both my right and left sides, a design that wrapped completely around me in 360 degrees. This wall seemed to be almost 100 feet distant from me in each segment, and I could just barely see it more clearly as my eyes just adjusted to the lighting. I quickly looked down, which would waste valuable time. As far as I could see below me, the wall extended on all sides all the way to the ground, down into the chasm that is beneath my feet. When I turned to gaze up, I saw that the wall closer to the water's surface appeared to slightly curve inward, resembling a hyperboloid structure. Of course, at the moment I wasn't genuinely pausing and contemplating every aspect of my situation in a sophisticated way. Instead, I was desperately turning my head to learn more about my frightening surroundings. However, as the seconds passed and my lungs started to hurt, I became aware that I was running out of time. I should have kept swimming up at that point and never looked behind me, or down in this case, if I hadn't heard something that made my blood chill, as if I were in freezing seas. I might have succeeded in doing so. Jackson, a frail, aged female voice said, one that was reflected in the water surrounding me. It seemed too clear to be coming from where I was stuck. Rather than being over 30 feet underwater, it sounded like someone was screaming my name from an empty hallway. I couldn't think clearly or absorb it at the time. All I could do was keep swimming up while looking down. My legs kicked more forcefully as my anxiousness increased, and I was unsure if the agony in my chest was caused by my lungs constricting or by bile that was about to spill out of my throat. Probably a blend of the two. The voice kept saying, "Jackson, don't go. Jackson," in an oddly distinct and understandable manner. It enabled me to understand the source's identity and location. Looking down below as I ascended farther to the surface, I noticed a terrifying scene between my moving feet. My recently departed grandmother, or someone who resembled her, was visible down below, at least a few dozen feet away, and she had a large metallic chain around her ankles, preventing any upward movement. Her skin was extremely wrinkled, her eyes were entirely whitened out, as if drawn in with chalk, and her long white hair flowed unkemptly above her head, giving her a Medusa-like appearance. I was certain it wasn't her. It was just another element of this nightmare that I was having while awake. But this time, like the last, I was having trouble swimming to the surface. As the darkness fell, my lungs strained more, and I began to lose consciousness. I truly tried to fight the pain, but I knew that it wasn't enough. I simply didn't want to concede. After a little period of time, everything turned black. Just a plain, agonizing lights out. I suddenly awoke instead, staring at the night sky, the light from the stars above shining down on me as I gazed up. Unlike the last time when I felt myself break the surface of the water and come up in a coughing fit. When I looked to my left and right as well as to my back and legs, I felt the hard pavement. On either side, I could make out my friend, who was hosting the pool party, and a few other guests. They were all looking down at me while displaying varying emotions of worry. I quickly found myself back where I had been before. The weeks that followed were, to put it mildly, confusing. The entire time I was at my grandmother's burial, I couldn't stop picturing the monster version of her that I had seen in the abyss. As awful as it sounds, let's just say that when we left, I wasn't exactly sad. I still have nothing but love and respect for her in my heart. But at one point, I believe I could decipher whatever this event was trying to do to me or tell me. Sadly, I realized this many years later when I was an adult. Nothing, no solutions, and no conclusive proof that what I'm going through isn't unique have I found. I browsed numerous publications and websites. I recognize that this may not be the most thorough research you can conduct. But what I don't understand is, if this were only occurring to me, why? Were there factors at work that I wasn't able to see? Was it a form of retribution for a transgression I had committed? After the second time, I realized it was me. Specifically, myself, not the water or the pool. Prior to that, I didn't believe in curses. I undoubtedly gave the idea some thought. But why had it begun to occur so suddenly? What had happened that every time I buried myself in water, I had to endure it? After all, before that initial incident, I had been swimming for months. Not being able to discover any answers or solutions is just so frustrated and hopeless. Hell, finding just one other person with the same issue would give me some sense of consolation. However, nothing. I've been affected in a strange way, and the world won't let me ask it why or how. While it didn't have nearly as much information as something like arachnophobia or claustrophobia, I did dig more into the history of thalassophobia. Still, I had more than plenty to do to keep myself occupied. I read through the usual suspects, old reports and transcripts of ship crew and sailor logs, as well as tales of sea monsters like Moby Dick and the Kraken. I was most intrigued